Hello, book people. PT here. I'm trying this new thing where I'm going to do some live streaming on Sundays throughout NaNoWriMo season, maybe beyond. We'll see. I wanted to do some writing talk videos, and I thought this would be fun. So, if you don't know me, my name is PT Hylton. If you just stumbled across this feed or whatever, I'm the author of three novels, the Deadlock trilogy, and six novellas, the Zane Halloway series, and some books for kids and some other stuff. But I wanted to talk. I'm going to be doing NaNoWriMo again this year, and I know probably a lot of you are as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and about kind of my approach. And the thing I wanted to talk about today is starting before you're ready. And I know that sounds kind of like a self-helpy kind of a corporate talk kind of words or whatever, but I think it really applies. And it's one of the things that I like about NaNoWriMo. So a lot of times, if you are in the writing blogs or writing videos or writing books or whatever, podcasts, you'll often hear about pantsers and plotters. Plotters being the ones who outline their stories before they start, and pantsers being the ones who maybe have a vague notion where it's going, but more kind of discover the story as they go. Both of the approaches are super valid. I'm more of a pantser for sure, but I do some plotting. Sometimes I have to. Like right now, I'm working on this a project that I was hired to do. I can't talk about too much yet, but for that I had to get my concept approved and then get an outline approved, and before I could start writing. So sometimes the choice is taken away from you. And I think good stories can result from either. I'm sure some of your favorite books and some of my favorite books have been written by pantsers, and some of my favorite books and your favorite books have been written by plotters. It's just the way it goes. But I think the thing that we talk about less, and we should probably talk about more, is the idea, especially those of us who write science fiction and fantasy. I think for newer writers, the question that often comes up is, how much world building should I do before I start? And again, much like pantsing and plotting, you have a whole spectrum. You have your Tolkien-esque people who develop an entire language and the cultures of every race in the book, and every planet or whatever, the 500-year histories of everyone, the royal succession lines, and the laws and everything like that, all the way to people who do very little to no world building. So this is actually one of the things I really like about NaNoWriMo, is that I think for a lot of newer writers, especially in the science fiction and fantasy space, they have an idea in their head that you have to have all this stuff developed before you can start. And I know people who spend months and months and months, and sometimes even more than a year, developing their worlds. And if that's what's fun for you, then that's fine. But a lot of times I think it can be used as an excuse not to start. You feel like, I'm not ready. I don't know how the crustacean races war 500 years ago with the Zunzabar race went, so I'm not going to fully understand their relation. So I got to really build that out before I can begin. So my advice is, do as little world building as you can get away with. Now, I'll get a little more specific because it's kind of vague, but obviously great works have been written with tons of world building in it as well. But I think a lot of times people do use that as like kind of an excuse to not start. Um, Personally, for me, I try to do as a little world building as possible. I'll use my Zane Halloway series as an example, which is a fantasy series. So you would think that there would need to be a ton of world building before I started. But literally, here's what I knew going into it. I knew that there were magical devices called thorns, which were um, offensive magic, and magical devices called tangles, which were defensive magic. And those two, and then there was a bit of an arms race between the people who made those, where the thorns makers would come up with a better thing, to better offensive magic, and then the tangles makers would have to come up with something to stop it, and then so it was a bit of an arms race. That's what I knew about the world, and I knew there was an assassin named Zane Halloway who felt like he had an apprentice, and he felt like at some point she would probably inevitably betray him. That's what I knew about the world going in. And obviously, if you've if you've read the books, or even if you haven't, it gets a lot more complicated than that. There's more magical devices. There's intricacies to how that all works. There's societies. There's the Ferric Society is the Assassins Guild basically, and the Abditus Society is the Magicians Guild. But the point is, all that world building stuff was built for the story. So as I was writing the story, I came up with that stuff as I was going, as the story needed those details. So rather than like mapping it out all beforehand, I built, let me say it this way, rather than building a story that fit into the world I created, I built a world around my story. For me, the story and the characters are always the more important thing. So there's a lot of I think one of my strengths as a writer is I know my strengths and weaknesses. And if you look at my reviews, you're probably not going to see any that are like, wow, this guy like writes the most beautiful sentences in the world. He's an amazing literary wordsmith. Probably won't see that. But what you do see a lot in my reviews is at the end of my series, almost if you look at my complete series books, the reviews of those almost always mention how neat and tidy and cool the endings are, the way they tie everything together so nicely. And I think the reason that works a lot in my books is because the world is built to the story. So if I'm throwing in details about the world, you better believe it's probably going to at some point come back into the story. If I talk about a king that's from 500 years ago, there's probably a reason that I'm bringing it up. I'm not just throwing it in there. So I think if you do too much world building beforehand, you're tempted to do an opening that's something like that ends up being something like the green flower of Lauriation, which bloomed once every 47 years, grew on the highest peak of Mount Horeb, and it's the very same flower that King Josaphat plucked to give to his lady love. You'll start with some great historical thing. That's the temptation, is when you build a huge world, you're tempted to throw in a lot of stuff that's not directly related to the story. So that's my advice especially for people. Maybe it's your first or second book, is build as little bit of the world as you possibly can. And I know that's weird advice. You might hear other advice from other people, but that's my advice. A side note to that, even if you're not writing in the fantasy and science fiction realms, is I know a lot of people will really develop out their characters before they start. They'll fill out like character biographies. There's like worksheets you can download that like have you fill out what is your character's favorite thing to eat for breakfast, and the most happiest, the saddest moment of your character's life, the happiest moment of your character's life, who was their best friend growing up, all that kind of stuff. I feel kind of the same way about that stuff that I do about world building, where I feel like if you develop all that stuff, you're going to be really, really tempted to shoehorn it in ways that don't serve the story. I much prefer to discover the world, discover the character as I'm going. Again, that's just my personal way of doing it. Yeah, I feel like you really are tempted. You got to be strong if you do that, not to put those in. The other thing, though, I guess the argument against that would be, and what you always hear from the people who are proponents of like really building out your character's biography before you start, is that it makes the world and the character seem richer, even if you don't use those details. The reader can somehow know that exists because it's there, it's in the background. I don't know. I don't necessarily buy that, but there are people it works for, so I'm just telling you what works for me and what doesn't work for me. So that is one of the things that I really like about NaNoWriMo, is that it makes you start before you're ready. It makes you just dive into the story, even if you don't have the vast amount of world building or character work done beforehand that you want to do. You have to dive in there and do it. So I'm excited. I'm going to be doing NaNoWriMo this year. I've got a fantasy concept lined up, kind of a vague concept that I have some idea where it's going, and I'm going to start it on Tuesday. And I hope you, if you're doing NaNoWriMo, I wish you all the best. I'll be back next Sunday with another little live stream. And if you have anything that you'd like me to talk about, put those in the comments and we'll talk about it then. All right, thanks so much for watching. I will talk to you next time.